Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, the landscape for Ivory Coast's upcoming elections is shaken up following the shock announcement of the passing of the country's Prime Minister. Amadou Gon Coulibaly died on Wednesday. He was the chosen candidate of President Alassane Ouattara in October's vote. Also, Human Rights Watch accuses burkinabe soldiers of extrajudicial killings of 180 men in the north of the country. The bodies were buried across several graves that have been dubbed killing fields. We hear from one of the authors of the report. And deep purple. It is a colour that has a long history in Tunisia. We take a look at the making of a particular rare dye known as Tyrian purple, which was once 15 times more expensive than gold and is no less valuable today. But first, Ivory Coast's Prime Minister, the ruling party's candidate for upcoming presidential elections, has died. Amadou Gon Coulibaly reportedly fell ill last week before passing away in hospital on Wednesday. He'd been handpicked by current leader Alassane Ouattara to run in October. Nicolas Chemin has more.
Amadou Gon Coulibaly returned to Ivory Coast last week. He had spent 2 months in France officially for a medical checkup. 8 years ago, he had undergone a heart transplant. Last week, he had tried to reassure Ivorians.
Je suis de retour pour prendre ma place aux côtés du président pour continuer l'œuvre de développement et de construction de notre pays, la Côte d'Ivoire.
In 1982, he graduated in engineering from a French university. Later, he became a member of parliament and agriculture minister. In January 2017, President Alassane Ouattara named him prime minister. Amadou Gon Coulibaly was 61 years old. He was married and had 5 children. His death will have immense repercussions for Ivorian politics. He had been chosen as the ruling party's candidate for the presidential election in October. Analysts now say that Ouattara will probably run again for a 3rd term. The constitution was changed in 2016 and he is allowed to be a candidate. But it's a decision that is likely to anger the opposition.
Well, Liane G. Bassompierre brings us more from Abidjan.
Everyone anticipated that when he came back last week that he'd taken the necessary time, 2 months, as you mentioned earlier, that he was in France, and that he would be coming back for the final sprint towards the elections. There were even talks that he would step aside from his role as prime minister and prepare his election campaign fully. But that, of course, has now not happened. The ruling party now has less than 4 months to try to find a successor for the presidential campaign. They had previously said there was no plan B, so it will be interesting what comes of the next few days, what comes out of the next few days, rather. We know that Defence Minister Hamid Bakayoko was acting prime minister in the interim that the prime minister was in France, so he could be a likely contender. But for now, the country is in mourning. The prime minister has passed away so suddenly.
Well, the US has threatened to pull security aid to Burkina Faso following reports that its army killed 180 men whose bodies were buried in mass graves in the northern town of Djibo. An investigation by Human Rights Watch recounts testimony from locals who say that many of the victims were blindfolded and had their hands tied behind their back before they were shot. The country's forces have been accused of repeated abuses in their efforts to tackle a growing jihadist insurgency that's forced around 1 million people from their homes. Corinne Dufka is the Sahel director for Human Rights Watch, and she was one of those who conducted many of the interviews relied upon in that report on Burkina Faso. Corinne, thanks very much for speaking to me. Can you give us a bit more about some of the key points of what was said to you by those locals that you spoke to in putting together this report?
Yes, indeed. From November, I started receiving reports and information about the appearance of bodies and conducted in-depth research over the last few months on it. Basically, the residents described the appearance of groups of bodies from 3 to 20 people, which started appearing along the main roads in and out of Djibo, as well as under bridges and in empty lots and so on. They were tied. Many of them were tied. They'd been shot. Their hands were bound. They said said that about 10 of the witnesses had seen these people, many of them family members, arrested in the days before they wound up dead, arrested by the security forces in and around Djibo. They were spread out over about a 5-kilometer radius from central Djibo.
Why would the Burkinabe army do something like this when it's supposed to be trying to make the country more secure rather than further terrorize communities? Why are you so sure that the army may be responsible for this?
The residents said that Djibo, while it is really the epicenter, in the epicenter of the insurgency in the north, it's a town that's heavily militarized. It's controlled by the army. There's a curfew from 7 p.m. or so, and the residents described how heavy trucks, were driving around town. They'd hear them. They would hear shots in the night, and then they'd wake up in the morning and see these bodies. So they said that it was very unlikely that any other armed group would be able to, to circulate freely like this in town. Furthermore, the victims were largely Polar Fulani, and the jihadists have of course, concentrated their recruitment on this ethnic group, and the security forces have previously engaged in collective punishment against this group, which they accuse of supporting the jihadists.
And where do things currently stand, the insurgency itself? Has the military made any headway?
Well, the situation in the Sahel has dramatically deteriorated in all 3 countries, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. We have seen hundreds of suspects and civilians killed in recent months. It's really deteriorating. And we believe very strongly that these kinds of allegations, these kinds of abuses by the security forces in all 3 countries, particularly in Burkina, are only complicating their fight against terrorism and pushing people who are full of vengeance to join the jihadist groups.
Now, the Burkinabe government has said that it will investigate. What do you hope to come from that? Do you believe that there really is a will to tackle this?
Well, that's really questionable because, again, since 2018, we and other groups, local and international, have denounced these kinds of killings, this pattern of abuse. And, they have frequently promised investigations, but there has been very little visible progress. The victims don't know anything about these investigations. So we really are pushing them this time to investigate and then to have the UN and other partners assist them, especially in forensic components of the investigation.
Thanks very much. Corinne Dufka there from Human Rights Watch. Well,
Thank
Africa's
you.
coronavirus infection rate has topped 500,000. Continent-wide, more than 508,000 cases have been logged, but the true figure could be far higher, as many countries have struggled to roll out testing drives. The rise in official numbers was partially driven by South Africa, the country most affected by the virus on the continent. It's recorded another day of more than 10,000 confirmed infections. Countries are trying to ramp up containment efforts. In Madagascar, heavy-handed measures have been brought in response to a spike in cases over the past week. Gael Borja reports.
The crackdown by authorities on those deemed to be flouting coronavirus lockdown rules was launched at the start of June. Hundreds of soldiers have been deployed into Amasna to reinforce lockdown measures. Michel still works as a security guard at this market, even though he's supposed to stay home because of the lockdown. When the police patrol discovered him, on the 3rd of June, a man was found unconscious in the street, sparking violent protests against police violence. Authorities are also using a heavy hand in tracking the spread of the virus. Positive cases are locked in buildings like this until they recover. That's what happened to this woman, who wants to remain anonymous for fear of reprisals. The authorities say an exceptional situation requires exceptional measures.
C'est une décision très difficile, mais je répète toujours, les contextes obligent. Et nous voyons actuellement les résultats.
Results that the opposition says have been manipulated.
On n'a pas les données réelles. Nous avons des données qui sont modifiées ou arrangées. On parle de données statistiques sur le plan sanitaire. Et on ne peut pas manipuler, on n'a pas le droit, c'est criminel.
Tougher policies have now been introduced to the capital, but their effectiveness is difficult to gauge, seeing as only 25,000 tests have been carried out in 4 months.
Now, the colour purple has a long history in Tunisia. A particular dye, known as Tyrian purple, was once 15 times more expensive than gold and is today produced by only a handful of people across the world. Made from snails, it's less in demand, but no less valuable now. A gram sells for between 800 and 3,500 euros. We meet one of the rare producers of the colour. Our team reports.
Alassane Ouattara is a history buff. Each week he follows this passion to the port of La Goulette in Tunis, where he buys materials to make an ancient dye known as Tyrian purple.
Là, je viens d'acheter des escargots de mer, on les appelle les murex. J'utilise ces escargots pour faire une teinture naturelle qui s'appelle la pourpre, une teinture vieille de 4000 ans, qui était le symbole de la richesse et du pouvoir.
Once he has these murex native to the Mediterranean, Alassane can produce the dye in the ancient way, as was done in the time of the Phoenicians. He gets to work in his little workshop in Tunis.
D'accord, donc là, on est en train de casser les coquilles, justement, pour extraire la glande à pourpre. Voilà, là, voilà. Ce petit bout de chair blanc.
He then dries these glands in salt to preserve them.
Elle est un peu rouge violacée. Donc chaque petite glande, elle contient une ou deux petites gouttes de ce qu'on appelle le précurseur de la pourpre, qui est initialement un liquide transparent.
Then it's the meticulous work of fermentation, which will take hours and many kilos of snails before yielding the desired result.
Et c'est des glandes et des pigments que j'ai fermentés depuis hier soir pour qu'ils redeviennent solubles dans l'eau. On a plongé dedans de la soie et de la laine. On va sortir la soie. Déjà, c'est pas la couleur finale parce que ça nécessite beaucoup plus de temps. Mais déjà, là, le bleu, c'est une couleur intermédiaire.
Once the precious dye is ready, it will yield colors varying from blue to indigo to violet. The pigment is sold for up to $4,000 to the rare enthusiasts around the world.
En général, c'est des archéologues, des historiens, des auteurs, mais aussi des experts en teinture naturelle qui utilisent ces petits kits pour faire des conférences, pour faire des présentations, pour présenter une couleur oubliée depuis des siècles.
Alassane uses the rest of the snails for cooking, their shells to make lime, and their pigment for painting. Every part is put to use in this craft from another era.
Well, that's it for Iron Africa. Thanks for joining us. Do so again if you can. Take care.